Look, I need to get this off my chest because I'm still processing how everything went so wrong when I was just trying to be honest about who I am. I'm Lorelai. I'm 32, and what happened to me is probably going to sound crazy, but I swear I'm telling you the truth about every single detail. So, here's the thing. I've always known I was different when it comes to love and relationships. Even back in college, I could develop these deep connections with multiple people at the same time. It wasn't about being promiscuous or anything like that. It was about having this capacity for meaningful emotional bonds that most people just don't understand. When I met Graham 7 years ago at this house party, he seemed like exactly what I needed at the time. Stable, reliable, someone who could provide the security I'd been missing in previous relationships. Graham was 28 then, working in logistics, and he had this whole life plan mapped out. Marriage, house, kids, retirement, all very traditional and structured. I was 25 and honestly kind of tired of dating guys who couldn't commit to anything beyond next weekend's plans. Graham felt safe, you know? He paid attention to me, remembered things I said, made these sweet gestures that showed he was actually invested in building something real. The first couple years were pretty good. We moved in together after about 8 months, and I took this part-time position doing client outreach while Graham handled most of the bigger expenses. It worked for us, because his salary was higher, and I liked having the flexibility to pursue other interests. But looking back, I think that financial arrangement set up this dynamic where Graham felt like he had more say in how we lived our lives. What started bothering me was how vanilla everything became. Graham is one of those guys who finds a routine and just sticks with it forever. Same restaurants, same group of friends, same activities every weekend. When I'd suggest trying something new, or meeting different people, he'd get this look like I was being unnecessarily complicated. He never said it directly, but I could tell he preferred when I was content to just go along with whatever he wanted to do. And the way he handled my friendships, especially with men, was always weird. I've never been the type of person to limit myself to female friends just because I'm in a relationship. I connect with people based on shared interests and intellectual compatibility, not gender. But Graham would get all tense whenever I mentioned hanging out with male coworkers or getting texts from guy friends. He'd never outright forbid it, but the disapproval was always there, making me feel guilty for having normal human connections. What really frustrated me was how he'd shut down any conversation about our relationship dynamics. If I tried to talk about feeling restricted or wanting more adventure in our lives together, Graham would either change the subject or give me this patronizing smile like I was going through some kind of phase. He had this way of making my feelings seem invalid, like wanting something different meant there was something wrong with me instead of something wrong with our setup. About 2 years ago, I started reading about alternative relationship structures, polyamory, ethical non-monogamy, all these concepts that actually made sense to me for the first time. It wasn't that I didn't love Graham. It was that I realized I had this capacity to love more than one person at a time. And that's not a flaw or a problem that needs fixing. That's just who I am. But every time I tried to bring up these ideas casually, Graham would shut down completely. He'd get this disgusted expression like I'd suggested something perverted instead of just discussing different ways people structure their relationships. It became obvious that he wasn't interested in growing or evolving or even understanding perspectives that challenged his narrow worldview. The real catalyst was when Soren started working in our office about 8 months ago. He's 29. And from day one, we had this incredible intellectual and emotional connection. Soren actually listened when I talked about my interests and ideas. He didn't try to redirect conversations back to safer topics or make me feel weird for having opinions that differed from his. We started having these amazing conversations during lunch breaks and sometimes after work. Soren had actually been in polyamorous relationships before. So, when I mentioned some of the articles I'd been reading, he didn't look at me like I was crazy. Instead, he shared his own experiences and helped me understand that what I was feeling was completely normal and healthy. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely seen and understood by someone. Of course, Graham immediately became suspicious. He'd make passive-aggressive comments about how much time I spent talking to Soren or ask pointed questions about our conversations. When I tried to explain that Soren was just a friend who happened to understand me, Graham would get this tight expression and say he trusted me but didn't trust Soren's intentions. It was so insulting because he was basically admitting he didn't think I was capable of handling myself around other men. The more Graham pushed back against my friendship with Soren, the more I realized how controlling and insecure he really was. Here I was finally connecting with someone who appreciated my mind and personality, and instead of being happy for me, Graham was threatened by it. It made me see our whole marriage differently. How many other connections had I avoided or downplayed just to make Graham comfortable? That's when I decided I needed to be completely honest with Graham about who I really am. I spent months researching polyamory, gathering books and articles, finding resources that explained it better than I ever could. I wasn't asking him to jump into anything immediately. I just wanted him to understand that this was a legitimate part of my identity, not some midlife crisis. I really believed that if I approached it the right way with education and patience, Graham would at least be willing to consider it. We'd been together 7 years. Didn't I deserve to have my authentic self acknowledged and respected? I wasn't trying to hurt him or replace him. I was trying to create space for both of us to be more honest about our needs and desires. I picked a Sunday evening when we were both relaxed, made his favorite dinner, and set up all the materials I'd gathered on the coffee table. Books about ethical non-monogamy, articles from relationship experts, testimonials from couples who'd successfully opened their marriages. I'd highlighted relevant passages, and even written down talking points so I wouldn't get flustered. I started by telling Graham how much I loved him, and how this wasn't about dissatisfaction with our relationship. I explained that I'd been doing self-reflection and research, and I discovered that polyamory wasn't just something I was curious about. It was actually a core part of my identity that I'd been suppressing for years. I told him I understood this might be surprising or challenging, but I hoped he'd be willing to at least look at the materials and consider what this could mean for our future. Graham's reaction was immediate and brutal. He didn't even let me finish before he started shaking his head and laughing. Not kindly, but this dismissive, cruel sound that made my stomach drop. He looked at the books and articles like they were something disgusting, then back at me with this expression I'd never seen before. He said absolutely not, that this wasn't something he was interested in discussing or considering, and that he couldn't believe I'd even brought it up. When I tried to explain that I wasn't asking for immediate decisions, just openness to learning, he cut me off completely. He said he'd married me, expecting monogamy, and that wasn't changing. Period. I felt completely slapped down. Here I was sharing the most vulnerable part of myself with the person who was supposed to love and support me unconditionally, and he was treating it like some kind of betrayal. I tried to stay calm and explain that this wasn't about wanting to cheat or being unhappy with him personally. I mentioned the research showing polyamory can actually strengthen primary relationships when done ethically. But Graham wasn't having any of it. He started asking accusatory questions about whether I was already interested in someone specific, whether this was my way of trying to justify cheating, whether I'd been lying about being satisfied in our marriage. When I mentioned that Soren had helped me understand some of these concepts, Graham's whole demeanor changed. He got this cold, angry look and said he knew there was something inappropriate going on. The conversation spiraled from there. Graham refused to look at any materials I'd prepared or consider that this might be a legitimate part of who I am. Instead, he focused entirely on Soren, like that was the only thing that mattered. He demanded I stop talking to Soren outside of work and drop this whole polyamory thing if I wanted to stay married. After that disaster, something shifted in me. I realized Graham was never going to accept the real me. So why should I keep pretending to be someone I'm not just to make him comfortable? He'd made his position crystal clear. He wanted a wife who would stay in the box he'd created for her. So I started investing more energy in relationships that actually fulfilled me. Soren and I began meeting for coffee more often, and those conversations became this lifeline. Finally, someone who could appreciate my complexity and intelligence without trying to diminish it. Soren never made me feel guilty for wanting something different from my marriage. Soren helped me understand that what I was feeling wasn't selfish or wrong. It was actually a more evolved way of thinking about love and connection. He could explain the philosophy behind polyamory in ways that made perfect sense. Most people are just too insecure and possessive to handle that level of emotional maturity. The more time I spent with Soren, the more I realized what I'd been missing in my marriage. Graham and I had barely talked about anything meaningful anymore. But with Soren, we could discuss philosophy, relationships, personal growth. All these topics Graham found threatening or boring. Soren actually valued my opinions. Instead of trying to redirect every conversation, Graham started getting even more suspicious and controlling. He'd make passive-aggressive comments about how much time I spent texting or how distracted I seemed. When I tried to share interesting thoughts I'd had, he'd get this glazed look like he was waiting for me to finish so he could change the subject. It was obvious he had zero interest in my inner life unless it directly related to him. Soren could see how the situation was affecting me. He'd point out how different I seemed after being home with Graham. More withdrawn, less confident, like I was dimming my own light to avoid conflict. It was eye-opening to have someone notice those patterns and validate that they weren't normal or healthy. That's when I started understanding this wasn't just about polyamory. It was about basic respect and autonomy. Graham claimed to love me, but he only loved the version of me that never challenged him or made him uncomfortable. He wanted a wife who would be grateful for his financial support and never question the limitations he placed on her emotional and social life. I began sharing more of these realizations with Soren, who was incredibly supportive and understanding. He never pressured me into any particular decision, but he did help me see that I deserved someone who appreciated all of me, not just the convenient parts. Our friendship deepened as I started being more honest about how trapped I felt. Soren had this way of making me feel valued and interesting again. When I talked, he actually listened and responded thoughtfully instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. He remembered details about things I'd mentioned weeks earlier. It was such a contrast to Graham, who seemed to forget most of what I said immediately. The physical attraction had always been there between Soren and me, but now it was getting harder to ignore. Not because I can't control myself, but because Soren represented everything missing from my relationship with Graham. He was emotionally available, intellectually curious, open to growth and new ideas. Being around him reminded me of who I used to be, before I started shrinking myself to fit into Graham's comfortable little world. The breaking point came when Soren and I were having coffee after work one evening. We'd been talking about some article he'd shared about relationship structures, and the conversation turned more personal. He mentioned how much he valued our connection, and how rare it was to find someone who could engage with these ideas so thoughtfully. We ended up kissing that night. It wasn't planned or calculated. It just happened naturally after months of growing closer and sharing things we couldn't share with anyone else. And honestly, it felt more authentic and right than anything I'd experienced with Graham in years. This was what real connection felt like when you weren't forcing it into some artificial box. I knew Graham would never understand if he found out. But that was his limitation, not mine. I wasn't doing anything wrong by seeking out the kind of connection my marriage wasn't providing. Graham had made it clear he wasn't interested in evolving or growing or meeting me where I was emotionally. For a few weeks, everything felt perfect. I had this amazing connection with Soren that fulfilled parts of me that had been starving for years, and I was still maintaining my marriage. It felt like a temporary solution, while I figured out how to approach restructuring our relationship. But Graham started noticing changes in my behavior. I was happier, more confident, more myself than I'd been in years. Instead of being glad his wife was thriving, he got more paranoid and started asking intrusive questions about my schedule and who I was spending time with. The surveillance got worse. He'd check my phone when he thought I was sleeping, ask detailed questions about every text, make comments about how I seemed different. Instead of having a mature conversation about what might be making me happier, he approached it like I was some criminal he needed to catch. I started being more careful about communications with Soren, not because I was doing anything wrong, but because I knew Graham would twist any evidence of our friendship into something sinister. We switched to a messaging app Graham wasn't familiar with, and were more discreet about when and where we met. But Graham is relentless when he gets suspicious. He started going through my laptop when I wasn't home, checking browser history, even looking through my purse. The irony was that his invasive behavior was pushing me closer to Soren, who offered the respect and trust Graham was incapable of showing. Before I could have another conversation with Graham about opening our marriage, he confronted me with evidence he'd found. He'd figured out how to access the messaging app Soren and I had been using and read through months of our conversations. I walked into the house and found him at the kitchen table with printouts of our messages spread out. The look on his face was something I'd never seen, not just angry but disgusted and hurt in a way that immediately put me on the defensive. He didn't give me a chance to explain before he started yelling about how I'd been lying and cheating behind his back. He threw the worst messages in my face. Ones where Soren and I had discussed physical attraction, where I'd vented about feeling trapped, where we'd talked about how much better our connection was. I tried to explain that this was exactly what I'd been trying to discuss when I brought up polyamory. These feelings weren't going away just because he refused to acknowledge them. And at least I'd been trying to find an ethical way to handle the situation. But Graham wasn't interested in understanding my perspective. He kept focusing on the physical aspects of my relationship with Soren, calling it cheating and betrayal, completely ignoring all the emotional and intellectual connections I'd tried to explain. When I pointed out that I'd literally tried to have this conversation months earlier and he'd shut it down, he said that didn't give me the right to go behind his back. But that's exactly the problem with Graham's thinking. He sees everything in black and white terms where you're either completely monogamous according to his standards or you're a cheater. There's no room in his worldview for the complexity of human relationships. I tried to explain that my connection with Soren had helped me understand myself better and made me happier. Wasn't that worth something? Didn't he want his wife thriving instead of slowly dying inside from suppressing fundamental parts of her personality? But Graham couldn't see past his own hurt feelings to consider what this might mean going forward. The fight escalated quickly. Graham demanded I cut off all contact with Soren immediately and commit to traditional monogamy if I wanted to stay married. When I pointed out this was exactly the kind of ultimatum that had created the problem in the first place, he accused me of not being willing to fight for our marriage. Finally, Graham told me he was done trying to understand my perspective and that I needed to decide what I wanted. Traditional marriage with him or whatever I'd created with Soren. He said he'd be staying at a friend's place while I figured out my priorities. And when he came back, he expected an answer. After he left, I felt relief and panic. Relief because I could finally stop walking on eggshells around his jealousy and control, but also panic because I realized Graham was never going to accept the real me, which meant our marriage was probably over. He'd made it clear he wanted a wife who would suppress fundamental parts of herself to make him comfortable. I spent those days really thinking about what I wanted my life to look like. Soren was incredibly supportive, helping me process emotions and figure out next steps. He reminded me that I deserved someone who celebrated my authenticity instead of punishing me for it. When Graham came back, I'd made my decision. I told him I understood he felt hurt, but I couldn't go back to pretending to be someone I wasn't. I explained that I'd tried to approach this honestly by bringing up polyamory months earlier, and when he shut that down completely, it created an impossible situation. I suggested maybe we could try counseling or read some books together about different relationship structures, just to see if there was any way to bridge the gap. But Graham had already made up his mind. He said trust was broken, and he couldn't be married to someone who didn't share his basic values about commitment. He'd already contacted a lawyer. The divorce process was brutal and vindictive. Graham hired an aggressive lawyer and tried to paint me as some serial cheater who'd been deceiving him throughout our entire marriage. He used the messages between Soren and me as evidence of adultery and argued I shouldn't get spousal support because I'd violated our marriage vows. It was so hypocritical because Graham had been the one refusing to communicate or consider alternatives to his narrow definition of marriage. I'd been trying to find ethical ways to address my needs and had literally attempted honest conversations, but the legal system doesn't care about emotional authenticity. They just see cheating or not cheating. The whole thing dragged on for months while lawyers argued about asset division and support payments. Graham fought me on everything, even stupid stuff like kitchen appliances. It was like he wanted to punish me financially for not being the wife he'd expected. Meanwhile, I had to find a new place and figure out how to support myself on just my part-time income. Soren was amazing during this period, helping me apartment hunt and offering emotional support when the legal stuff got overwhelming. But I started noticing he seemed less available than when I was still married. When I was forbidden fruit, he'd been all about deep conversations and romantic gestures. Now that I was actually free to be with him, he seemed more hesitant and distant. As weeks turned into months, it became clear something had shifted between us. He started making comments about not wanting to be seen as the reason my marriage ended and needing space to figure out what he really wanted. When I tried to talk to him about it, he gave me stuff about how he'd never meant for things to go this far. It felt like another betrayal. Soren had been the one encouraging me to be authentic and true to myself. He'd been pointing out how much happier I seemed with him, versus with Graham, but apparently that was all just talk, because when it came time to actually build something real together, he wasn't interested. I started wondering if Soren had just been enjoying the ego boost of being wanted by a married woman. And once I was available, the thrill was gone. Either way, I felt like I'd been led on and manipulated into making decisions that destroyed my marriage and financial security. But even worse was watching how quickly Graham seemed to move on. Within 6 months of our divorce being finalized, I started seeing pictures on social media of him with this new woman. She looked so basic and conventional, exactly the kind of person who would never challenge him or make him question anything. They looked happy in all their photos, doing the same boring activities Graham had always preferred. It was like he just plugged another woman into the exact same life template and moved on without missing a beat. What really got to me was how his friends and family embraced this new woman immediately. These were people who'd known me for 7 years. But as soon as Graham introduced his new girlfriend, they acted like I'd never existed. Meanwhile, I was struggling to rebuild my life from scratch. The apartment I could afford was tiny and in a not great neighborhood. I had to increase my work hours significantly just to cover basic expenses, which left me exhausted most of the time. The financial independence I'd thought I wanted turned out to be much harder when I was actually living it. Dating was a complete disaster. The apps were full of guys who either wanted nothing but hookups or were looking for someone to immediately move in with. When I tried to explain I was interested in exploring non-monogamous relationship styles, most guys either got weird about it or assumed I was just looking for casual sex. The few men who claimed to be interested in polyamory turned out to be just as disappointing as Soren. They loved the idea in theory but couldn't handle the actual emotional complexity. Or they were using the polyamory label as an excuse to avoid commitment while keeping multiple women on rotation. I started feeling really isolated and lonely in ways I hadn't anticipated. The friends Graham and I had shared mostly sided with him after the divorce, especially once they met his new girlfriend and saw how normal and drama-free she seemed compared to me. My family was disappointed in me for throwing away what they saw as a good marriage. Soren eventually transferred to a different department, claiming it was for a better opportunity, but obviously it was really to avoid the awkwardness of working near me every day. Before he left, he gave me this patronizing speech about how he hoped I'd find what I was looking for and how he was sorry things hadn't worked out, like he was some innocent bystander instead of someone who'd actively encouraged every decision I'd made. About a year after the divorce, I ran into Graham and his new girlfriend at the grocery store. They were shopping together, looking completely comfortable and domestic, discussing dinner plans like an actual couple who enjoyed spending time together. When Graham saw me, he got this awkward expression and muttered a quick hello before steering his girlfriend toward a different aisle. But I caught a glimpse of how he looked at her when he thought I couldn't see. Attentive and affectionate in a way he hadn't looked at me in years. It was obvious he was actually happy with this woman, that she gave him whatever he'd been missing in our marriage. 2 years post-divorce, my life still feels unsettled and incomplete in ways I didn't expect. I thought freedom and authenticity would feel more satisfying than this. Instead, I'm lonelier than I've ever been, financially stressed, and surrounded by people who see me as a cautionary tale about what happens when you throw away a good thing. The dating scene hasn't improved. I'm 34 now, and most decent guys my age are either married or dating women in their 20s who don't come with divorce baggage and complicated ideas about relationship structures. The men who are interested tend to be recently divorced and bitter, or much older guys who see me as some kind of adventure. I've tried going to polyamory meetups thinking I'd find my people there, but honestly, most of those communities are pretty dysfunctional too. There's a lot of drama and jealousy disguised as enlightened relationship philosophy, and too many people using non-monogamy as an excuse to avoid dealing with their own emotional issues. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I just stuck with Graham and tried to find fulfillment within our marriage. But then I remember how stifled and invisible I felt, and I know I couldn't have lived that way forever. The hardest part is that I can't really talk to anyone about how isolated I feel sometimes because admitting that would mean acknowledging that maybe I was wrong about everything. So here I am supposedly living my authentic life, but feeling more disconnected than ever. Graham is thriving with someone who appreciates his traditional approach. Soren is off living his best commitment-free life. And I'm stuck trying to convince myself that being alone and struggling is somehow more honest than being settled and content. But I can't go backward now, and I refuse to spend the rest of my life feeling guilty about choices that felt right at the time. Everyone else can judge me for prioritizing my own needs. But at least I know I was brave enough to try for something different instead of just accepting whatever life handed me. Even if it didn't work out the way I hoped, at least I didn't spend my whole life wondering what if.